I woke to the dull ache behind my temples and the sharp sting of paper cuts on my fingers. At first I thought I'd torn a gift tag or ripped through wrapping paper too aggressively in my half-asleep state. But when I blinked away the remnants of sleep and saw the envelope lying on the kitchen counter, its edges crisp, the parchment unnaturally sterile, among our holiday decorations, I knew something was off. It wasn't wrapped in festive paper, nor did it bear his familiar loopy handwriting. Instead, the official seal of the county courthouse glared up at me like a bad omen. My coffee sat untouched beside it, steam curling upward and mingling with the scent of pine from the little tabletop tree. I could hear the soft hum of Christmas tunes playing downstairs, lights blinking in cheerful rhythms, but none of it registered. All I felt was a cold tightening in my chest as I stared at the envelope as though it might bite. With shaking fingers, I peeled it open. The letterhead read, Clerk of Superior Court, and beneath it the words, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled out the thick stack of papers, each page legally bound by a golden staple. The first line hit me like a blow. The above-named petitioner, John Michael Harris, respectfully petitions this court for a decree dissolving the bonds of matrimony between petitioner and respondent. Respondent, that was me. The word echoed in my mind, cold and clinical, stripping away every ounce of warmth I'd ever associated with our vows. I crumpled the papers in my fist, wincing as the edges cut into my palm, and felt tears press behind my eyelids. It was Christmas morning, a time when the world was supposed to shimmer with hope and possibility. The tree in the living room was adorned with silver ribbons and glass ornaments that caught the early sunlight streaming through the window. Stockings hung by the fireplace, embroidered with our names. Maximum effort invested for the perfect Instagram shot we'd never post. The scent of gingerbread lingered in the air from cookies I'd baked the night before. Imagining our laughter as we opened them, freshly iced together, instead there was an eerie silence, no footsteps on the stairs, no distant murmur of his voice, only the rustle of my own panic. Drowning out the soft jingle from the speakers, I sank onto the kitchen stool, clutching the divorce papers to my chest as though they were a stranger's confession. How long had he planned this? Had he drafted these documents weeks ago, clicked them to print, and tucked them here, waiting for the most sacred morning of the year to serve me the final blow? The thought made bile rise in my throat. I thought of the decade we'd spent side by side, late nights, holding each other on the couch, arguing over silly things like whose turn it was to wash the dishes, kissing under the streetlights when the world felt cold. All of that had been real to me. Perhaps to him it was just practice. Steps in a dance he'd mastered decades before and now wanted to exit gracefully. I unfolded the papers again, scanning for a date. There it was in fine print. December 25th, served at 8:03 a.m. He had timed it perfectly. We'd always wanted to be early risers on Christmas, he claimed it was the only day when the world still held magic before the chaos of rising sun and obligations. And here he was, presenting me with the most shocking gift I could imagine. Our life together, neatly wrapped in legal jargon and handed back like a returned sweater. I felt my knees buckle, bracing myself against the counter. My hand trembled so violently that the mug beside me rattled, its porcelain ringing out in sharp contrast to the soft holiday playlist. In that moment, my thoughts raced through every late-night whisper, every look of distraction I'd chalked up to work stress. The sudden week-long conferences he attended without telling me where he was going, the credit card statements showing charges at boutique hotels in cities I'd never visited, the tens of thousands of dollars withdrawn in cash as explanation, always as vague as business expenses. I had dismissed it as the price of success, trusting him without reservation. Love had felt like the ultimate safeguard, but now love seemed like the perfect camouflage. I piled the papers onto the counter, spilling them like a confession on the linoleum floor. Each page felt heavier than the last property settlements, custody clauses, should we ever adopt a child, the division of assets painstakingly itemized. It was all there, in black and white, the beach house in Santa Barbara, our joint savings, the vintage record collection he'd once said was the soundtrack of our life. He had even included a clause about who would keep the cat. My heart ached at that detail, so small, so cruel. A reminder that he had thought of everything except how I might feel. My phone buzzed in my Pacuta text from my sister with a reminder. Mom's coming over in 10 with the eggnog. I ignored it. I couldn't bear the forced cheer. Instead, I dialed his number. It rang 3 times before the message clicked on. Sorry, I can't talk right now. Busy. Leave a message. I closed my eyes and pressed the phone against my ear, willing his voice to come back, to tell me this was a horrible mistake. I left a voicemail, my voice unsteady. John, Merry Christmas. Are you? You filed the divorce. Please, call me. I replayed the message once, twice, hoping that somehow, through the scratchy transmission, he'd realize the magnitude of what he'd done and cancel it. Silence answered me. Only silence and the faint echo of sleigh bells on Spotify. I sat there for what felt like hours until my eyes burned from staring at the blurred text on the divorce papers. Finally, I stood, stacking them neatly as though they were letters from an ex-lover I could burn later. I wiped at my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cold winter air seep into my lungs. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of gray, the world gleaming with frost. I remembered the Christmas mornings of my childhood, how my mother would slip gifts under the tree before dawn, how my father would wrap me in his arms and whisper, "This is love." Back then, I believed in simple things: joy, family, a promise of forever. Now, in my own kitchen, I realized that forever could be rescinded on Christmas morning with a stack of papers with deliberate calm. I swept the documents into a folder, zipped up my coat, and stepped out the front door. The cold hit me like a shock, but I welcomed it. Anything to keep me awake, to prevent me from crumbling right there on the porch. The neighborhood was still quiet, houses dusted in snow, wreaths adorning every door, lights twinkling like distant stars. I trudged down the walkway, each step a reminder that, for the first time, I was venturing into a future without him. The envelope felt heavy in my pocket, but somehow, carrying it felt like carrying a lifeline. Christmas morning had turned into something I never imagined it yet. As the sky lightened into day, I realized that even in devastation, there might be a path forward. I tucked the folder under my arm, squared my shoulders against the rising sun, and walked. For 10 years. Everyone who knew us believed we had the kind of marriage people write sappy greeting cards about. We moved into that small craftsman bungalow when we were fresh out of college. Not much more than a patched-up rental with creaking floors and a leaky faucet in the kitchen, but we painted the walls together, hung our wedding portrait above the fireplace, and swore we'd grow old there. Weekends were spent curled up on the couch with mugs of coffee and dog-eared novels. Weeknights ended with him stirring pasta sauce as I chopped garlic at the counter. We had Friday night pizza traditions, annual beach trips where we chased the sunset, and Christmas mornings spent hanging stockings by the hearth. Every anniversary, he'd surprise me with a little bouquet of wildflowers because he remembered how I once made a wish on a dandelion stem. To me, those rituals meant devotion. To everyone else, they meant stability. To him, I'm still not entirely sure what they meant. Because somewhere in the middle of those cozy routines, things started to shift. It was so gradual that I barely noticed at first a sideways glance instead of a warm smile. A quick check of his phone when I walked into the room, hushed phone calls that ended abruptly whenever I came near. He'd tell me work was demanding, that deadlines were pressing, but instead of sharing the weight, he'd shut me out. I chalked it up to stress. Of course, a budding career in finance would require late nights. I offered to bring him lunch at the office, left encouraging notes by his bedside lamp, made him his favorite chicken soup when he complained about indigestion. He thanked me, sure, but not with the same spark in his eyes that he'd had when we first met. Instead, he gave me practiced thank yous, as though gratitude itself had become routine. Looking back, I find little breadcrumbs of warning everywhere. The unexplained withdrawals from our joint accounts maul at first, then creeping higher. He'd say it was an investment opportunity, reassure me there was nothing to worry about. And why would I worry? I believed in us. I believed in him. The late-night meetings at some trendy new bar downtown, he said it was networking. I pictured him charming clients, closing deals, imagining the day those nights would pay off for both of us. I never asked for names or details. Love made me trust blindly. Friends began to drop hints, polite but pointed. "You haven't invited me over in months," one would say. Eyebrows raised when I gave excuses. Another would comment on how rarely he came to our gatherings now. Always distracted, always watching the door. I'd laugh it off. "We're just busy. That's all. You know how it is." But inside, a tiny knot of unease began to form. The kind you can swallow, but that knits into your stomach like cold wool. And then there was the anniversary that changed everything. Year 7, we celebrated in Napa an indulgence we'd promised ourselves once the mortgage was paid off. I pictured him popping the cork on a celebratory bottle under the oak trees, raising a glass to another year of partnership. Instead, he excused himself, mid-dinner, saying he needed some air, promising he'd be right back. I watched him walk away down the candlelit path, chest tightening, until he disappeared around a corner and didn't return for hours. By the time he came back, hair tousled, eyes distant, my heart had galloped into my throat. He brushed it off as a mix-up with the concierge, a misread text, but when I reached for his hand, he pulled away. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant chirp of crickets and the pounding in my ears. I replayed every conversation, every lingering glance, every hurried excuse. But the next morning, under the bright California sun, we smiled for tourist photos, raised our glasses in a toast to us, and slid right back into our practiced routine because believing the worst meant admitting I'd been naive. And we can't have that, can we? After that, the changes sped up. He stopped planning date nights and started asking me to handle the bills alone. He refused to discuss the future, claiming he needed space to find himself. He came home, smelling faintly of a floral cologne I'd never purchased for him, the scent too heady to be anything but someone else's. I mentioned it, trying to keep my voice light. He waved it away, said I was imagining things. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. But slowly I pieced together the evidence. Hotel receipts slipped into suit pockets. Phone records showing long calls to an unknown number at 3 in the morning, text messages that flickered on screen, just long enough for me to glimpse words like, "Can't stop thinking about you." By the time I confronted him, hands trembling as I brandished printouts of bank statements and transaction alerts, he looked at me as if I'd betrayed him. His voice was calm, almost eerily gentle when he said, "I can't explain everything, right now, but trust me, it's not what you think." And I wanted so desperately to believe him. I wanted us to collapse back into that comfortable rhythm, the one where we were invincible together. But that night, I realized I'd lost more than I'd ever recognized. I'd lost access to his truth. I spent weeks and a days sifting through our life in search of a clue. Photo albums felt hollow pictures of us smiling at birthday parties. At graduation, at candlelit dinners now, framed by suspicion, every shared secret, every promise, every forever became suspect. And yet, I clung to one thing. Hope that there was a reasonable explanation, that the man I fell in love with was still in there, somewhere behind the late-night whispers and the unexplained absences. But deep down, I knew those whispers weren't about work. Those absences weren't about meetings. They were about something I had no inkling of, something he protected me from knowing. And that unspoken knowledge pressed against my ribs like a weight I couldn't bear forever. Perfect marriage, or so I believed, had cracks beneath the glossy surface, and I was about to pry them open. They say the first clue is often the one you ignore, and I was a master at ignoring them. It started with friendly questions from neighbors. "Is John traveling again?" One would ask over the fence, voice pitched low, as if sharing a delicious secret. I'd smile and nod, citing work deadlines and networking dinners. But each inquiry left a residue of unease, like a faint perfume you can't identify but suddenly notice on your clothes. Rumors began to swirl, nothing concrete, just hushed whispers over backyard barbecues and PTA meetings. "I saw him getting into a black sedan," someone confided. "He didn't say goodbye." Another neighbor swore she glimpsed him slipping into a hotel lobby, crossing a threshold meant for guests, not mortgage holders in cozy cardigans. My immediate reaction was defensiveness. My husband was too honorable, our marriage too solid for this petty gossip, but the seed was planted. At first there was relief and denial. If you don't acknowledge a problem, it doesn't exist. I continued folding laundry, planning meals, lighting candles in soft spirals around our bedroom, convincing myself that a little faith could smooth every wrinkle. Yet every time my phone buzzed with a new text message, my heart lurched, especially when his name appeared on the screen at odd hours. I'd pick it up, see just a timestamp, and let it drop back on the counter, telling myself it was a work memo or a reminder about the mortgage. It never occurred to me to open it immediately. He always seemed so busy, why would I intrude? But as the weeks passed, the cracks widened. I found myself lingering by the stairs, listening for the click of the key I expected at 6:30 p.m. Most nights. One evening, though, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no door. The house remained unnaturally quiet. The only sound, the blinking lights on the security panel. I checked my watch. 7:15 p.m. He'd texted 3 hours earlier. "Late meeting. Don't wait up." I'd nodded at my phone screen and returned to the television. But that sense of something off had gnawed at me all evening. I replayed his words, 3 hours. Meetings rarely lasted that long, even on his busiest days. That same night, I opened our joint bank statement. Always a routine chore, never a revelation. My eyes stuttered over a transaction I didn't recognize. A withdrawal of $2,500 at an upscale boutique hotel downtown. No note, just the debit. I stared at the number, wondering if I'd misread the category. The next day, I casually asked him about it over morning coffee. He looked up from his cup, espresso swirling like storm clouds, and gave me a quick, forced smile. "Business expense," he said, voice clipped. "You know how it is." But his eyes drifted away as though the words themselves bored him. That was the moment I realized I couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. Over the next few days, I turned detective. I downloaded our phone provider's usage history, printed out detailed logs, and pored over hundreds of entries, tracing call durations and text counts. Each late-night session with my printer felt like resurrecting a ghost I wasn't sure I wanted to face. I needed proof, for peace. I discovered dozens of calls at 2 a.m., each lasting 15, then 20, then sometimes 30 minutes. The names were coded: home, office, bank. But at 2 a.m., those labels made no sense. One number stood out unlabeled, so I ran a quick reverse lookup. No firm connection, no office address, just a name I'd never heard. My gut dropped. The whispers weren't empty gossip. They were clues. And then there were the texts. Brief, cryptic messages. "Can't wait. You saved me tonight." He'd delete them within seconds, but sometimes I caught the tail end as the screen faded. A glimpse of words promising rendezvous, affection, secrets. It felt like reading a letter penned in a language I no longer understood. Instead of confronting him outright, I printed the logs, highlighting every suspicious entry in neon yellow. 3:14 a.m., 4:02 a.m., 11:47 p.m. I carried those pages everywhere, memorizing numbers like a ritualistic chant. I felt guilty, ashamed that I'd become this person, secretive, obsessive, yet powerless to stop myself. Better to know than to live in denial, I told myself. It was on a rainy Tuesday that I found the most damning clue of all, a tiny, unmarked key tucked into the lining of his leather jacket pocket. I was halfway through doing a load of laundry when I noticed the jacket draped carelessly over a chair. He must have been in such a rush, late again, that he shoved it there without a second thought. The glint of metal caught my eye, so small, so innocuous. I held it between thumb and forefinger, puzzled. It wasn't for our front door, nor did it match the car fob. No keychain emblem, no identifying mark, just a slender shaft and an ornate bow. A skeleton key, perhaps. My pulse pounded as I eyed the jacket cuff, imagining where else it could have come from. An old chest, a hidden drawer, a locker. I stuffed it into my pocket, mind racing. That night, I lay awake, the key cold against my pillow, weighing heavier than any marital vow. Rain tapped against the window like the ticking of a clock, urging me to act. At 2:47 a.m., I crept downstairs, heart hammering, and flicked on the hall light. My phone flashlight illuminated the counter where I dumped the contents of my purse. Wallet, lipstick, and the key. I held it up, turning it in my palm, marveling at the delicate grooves. Tomorrow, I'd find out what it unlocked. Tomorrow, I'd demand answers. My breath came in short bursts, anticipation and dread coiling inside me like a live wire. By morning, the whispers had evolved into a roar in my mind. I could no longer pretend everything was fine. Everyone around me seemed to know something I didn't. Every sideways glance felt like a challenge. Uncover the truth or remain the fool. My eyes were open now, wide with fear and curiosity. I had become the protagonist in a story I never auditioned for, a story of betrayal and hidden lives. And I was desperate to read the next chapter. So I grabbed my coat, the key burning a hole through the fabric of my pocket, and stepped into the gray world outside, determined to follow the whispers wherever they led. If I discovered a secret I could never forget, I still remember the moment. I discovered the unmarked envelope. It was a Thursday evening, the sky already bruised purple from a long day's toil, and I'd come home determined to find out what that tiny, ornate key unlocked. Hours had passed since I'd retrieved it from the pocket of his leather jacket. Accident, he insisted, brushing it off when I'd pressed him that morning, but I knew better. Some part of me, the part that refused to swallow false reassurances, had guided my hand to that hidden pocket and revealed the key's secret. Now, rain tapped insistently against the window panes as I hunted for the lock it belonged to, each echoing drip of a countdown to the truth. I began where most people hide their most personal possessions, the closet. I rifled through mountain ranges of folded sweaters and hanging coats, searching for any sign of a locked box, a hidden drawer, or a padlock clasped around some unremarkable case. Nothing. Then I moved to the study, his sanctuary of spreadsheets and business journals, where I rummaged through filing cabinets that he'd always kept organized and color-coded. I pulled out folders labeled taxes, retirement, client contracts, and even the innocuous one marked personal. It was behind that last folder that I found the envelope. Unlike the courthouse stamped papers I'd woken up to on Christmas morning, this envelope was unremarkable. Plain ivory, the flap sealed with a smear of wax that carried no emblem. No initial, only an impression that had faded too faintly to identify. No date, no return address. Just a mysterious promise of revelation. My heart kicked against my ribs as I picked it up, the envelope's smooth surface pressing into my palm. It felt fragile, like the fragile bond of trust I still clung to, yet also heavy with implication. Whatever lay inside could change everything. I slipped the key from my pocket and held it against the envelope, half expecting it to react, to glow or shiver. But of course it did nothing. This key was not for paper. No, it demanded a metal lock. Something hidden in plain sight. I pocketed the envelope and key, determined to find their counterpart. First, though, I needed silence and solitude. So I told myself I'd retreat to the attic after dinner, where dusty trunks and forgotten heirlooms waited like sleeping giants. Dinner that night was mechanical. I ate reheated pasta, sipped red wine, all the while my mind racing through scenarios. Was this evidence of a second family? Embezzlement? Something far more mundane, like a journal of private regrets? I caught myself second-guessing. Perhaps he had banked his fears alongside mine, safeguarding something important but not damning. But the doubts were fleeting. They'd vanish whenever I pictured those late-night text messages, the whispered phone calls, the withdrawals from our account that he'd called business expenses. He had secrets. The key and the envelope were proof that his deception ran deeper than I'd imagined. After stacking the dishes, I slipped into my walking shoes and grabbed a flashlight. The attic door creaked as I opened it, the stairs cold beneath my feet, as though I were intruding on a holy sanctuary of the past. Boxes lined the walls, Christmas decorations from decades ago, photo albums from our courtship, a battered suitcase that hadn't seen the light since our honeymoon. I explored their contents quickly. Christmas ornaments, my grandmother's embroidered linens, his old college textbooks. Nothing called for a key. I began to feel the familiar frustration creeping. Maybe the lock wasn't up here at all. I climbed down, retracing my steps through the dimly lit hallway, and paused outside the bathroom. Something about the door stopped me. He'd renovated it last year, modern fixtures, sleek lines, a lock that clicked smoothly when closed. I knocked softly, testing the latch. It swung open freely, and on the inside of the door, behind the towel rack, I noticed a small panel where the drywall didn't quite align. A faint shadow behind it hinted at space. My pulse raced as I knelt to look more closely. Yes, there was a seam, barely visible, but definitely there. I pressed the key into the groove, wiggled it gently, and heard a soft click as the panel popped open like a secret hatch. My flashlight beam quivered over a narrow cavity carved into the wall. Inside lay a slim drawer, dust motes dancing in the shaft of light. I pulled it out and gasped. Stacked neatly within were manila envelopes, each labeled with months and years, but never with their true contents. The top one was dated 2 years ago, then another 6 months ago. At the bottom lay the unmarked ivory envelope I'd discovered in the study. I placed the drawer on the floor and emptied its pile onto the tiled bathroom. Heart pounding so fiercely, I thought I'd wake the whole house. My fingers trembled as I lifted the first envelope from the stack. The older ones contained innocuous things. A letter he'd written to himself on our anniversary. Invoices from a surprise renovation I didn't know about. Ticket stubs from a concert he'd taken me to as a birthday gift. But beneath those, the unmarked envelope seemed to pulse with importance. I reached for it and held it like a fragile relic. I stood, envelope and key in hand, and went to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. Kneeling at the foot of our mahogany wardrobe, I probed the corners for any sign of a locked box or hidden chest. My hands brushed against the edge of a false bottom in the drawer where he kept his cufflinks. I pried it open with the corner of the key and found inside a small, weathered wooden box. Its surface was smooth but scratched along the edges as though someone had carried it through years of motion. I pried off the lid and my breath caught. Inside lay the final piece of the puzzle. Leather-bound journal and a collection of plane tickets folded into an envelope, marked simply 2025. The journal's cover bore my initials, E.G., embossed in gold, the same as the divorce papers. My mind tugged in conflicting directions, fear of what I'd find, and an urgent need to know. I opened the ivory envelope from the bathroom's hidden drawer and read the single sheet of paper within. His handwriting, so familiar, seemed strange, now neat but cautious, each word measured. It began, "My dearest Emily, I know you deserve to wake up to joy today, not to these painful words. Please understand that this was never meant to hurt you." My eyes stung as I read on, uncovering why he'd drafted divorce papers on Christmas morning, why he'd needed a safety net in case of his imminent disappearance. The paper detailed a terminal diagnosis he'd kept hidden for months, aggressive and unforgiving. He spoke of his love for me, his shame at becoming a burden, and his wish to free me to rebuild without the shadow of illness. The key, he wrote, would unlock this hidden cache. Each item was his way of ensuring that, when he couldn't speak, I'd still know his truth. My breath caught mid-sentence as realization crashed through me. He'd been hiding his own mortality, doing everything he could to spare me the heartbreak of his decline. I sank to the floor, clutching the envelope, the key, the journal, all of it a testament to his love and fear. He'd built a secret world for me, one I was never meant to enter until the end. The whispering rumors, the late-night calls, none of them were about another woman or another life. They were about his struggle, his silent battle. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it all settle. Betrayal transformed into compassion, confusion into clarity. The hidden drawer, the envelopes, the journal, they were his final gift to me. Mercy and the truth. As tears slid down my cheeks, I gently laid the envelopes back in the drawer, returned the key to its leather pocket, and whispered into the hush of the apartment, "Thank you for trusting me with your secret." In that moment, I knew the real journey was just beginning. I walked into the bank lobby the next morning feeling as though I were crossing into another world. The polished marble floors still gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, and tellers spoke in hushed tones to customers who waited patiently at the counters. But none of that registered. I was on a mission. Clutching the small brass key in my palm like a talisman, he checked his screen, nodded, and handed me a form. To sign. As I did, I thought of how many times he might have sat here before me, explaining a mysterious illness as routine tests or follow-up appointments that never made it home to me. My heart thudded each time I remembered his stoic face as he muttered reassurances, even as the cancer was already reshaping his body. When the paperwork was complete, the clerk disappeared behind a gray door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," leaving me with my racing thoughts and the distant hum of photocopiers. A minute later, he returned and led me down a narrow hallway, walls lined with safety deposit boxes, metal doors gleaming like rows of eyes watching my every step. He unlocked one with a click and slid a small drawer beside me. Inside lay a single cedar box wrapped in a battered leather strap, the very same wooden box I had covertly pried open in my home. My breath caught. My fingers trembled as I slipped out the brass key I'd found in his jacket, the one that fit this life-altering lock. The moment the lid swung open, I was hit by the faint scent of aged paper and rusted hinges. I set the box on the countertop and lifted the lid fully. Inside was a stack of manila folders, each one meticulously labeled in his precise handwriting. Medical Report Number 1 Oncology Lab Results. Medical Report Number 2 MRI Scan Analysis. Travel Itinerary Oslo to Basel. Correspondence My Love. My Last Christmas. And more. I pulled out the first folder and unfolded the glossy pages. Bloodwork charts, biopsy images, pathology notes, all confirming the diagnosis he'd fought to conceal. Stage 4. Aggressive margin, prognosis, measured in months, not years. I pressed the edge of the folder to my lips, as though seeking comfort from his words printed in cold ink. At that moment, the clerk cleared his throat. I looked up, wincing to break eye contact with the impersonal world of the bank. He offered a polite nod, reminding me I wasn't alone. I managed a shaky smile and returned my attention to the folders. I moved to the next one, plane tickets, open-ended, spanning cities I'd never associate with him. Helsinki, Zurich, Barcelona. Each ticket had a handwritten note in the margin, for treatments, for trials, for hope. My chest tightened as I imagined him boarding those flights alone, clutching these tickets like prayer beads. He had done all this in secret, splurging thousands from our account to chase clinical trials, experimental therapies. Any slim chance of survival, all without telling me? The next folder held letters, bound in a dozen matching envelopes. I drew out the top one, saw the date, August 12th, a month before our 10th anniversary. Inside was a letter addressed to me, his handwriting wavering ever so slightly. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, I have already frightened you enough. Please know that every decision I made was driven by love and fear. My throat burned as I read on how he'd agonized over whether to tell me, how he'd feared that my grief would consume me or that I would abandon him in desperation. He'd poured out his soul onto these pages, begging forgiveness for the deception, pleading for me to remember the man he was before the diagnosis, and ending each letter with the same refrain. I hope you understand why I left you no choice but to carry on without me. I pressed my palm to my lips, tasting tears I refused to shed in public. Turning, I noticed the clerk fidgeting politely behind the counter, ready to lock the door at my signal. I tucked the folders back into the cedar chest, each one sliding into place as if reclaiming its role in his hidden legacy. With a trembling hand, I closed the lid and locked it with the brass key. The drawer slid shut with a firm click. The clerk withdrew the bank's master key, secured the lock, and replaced the drawer. We stood in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between us. I had retrieved more than documents. I'd uncovered the raw truth of his final months. Back in the lobby, I clutched the small cedar box to my chest as though it were his heart. The festive wreaths hanging near the entrance mocked me with their bright ribbons and jingling bells, reminding me of the Christmas we were supposed to share. But instead of unwrapping gifts, I had unwrapped his deepest, most painful secret. People milled around me, couples, families with children in tow, the elderly clutching pension check envelopes, but none of them knew the weight I carried. None would ever understand that the safety deposit box had held not money or jewels, but the evidence of a dying man's desperate love. I found an empty corner near the exit, set the cedar box on a low bench, and sank to my knees beside it. My fingers traced the scarred wood grain, and I closed my eyes, inhaling the lingering scent of his handwriting on the folder tags. A wave of grief washed over me, raw and overwhelming, and I let my tears fall freely. I cried for the man who had tried to fight alone. I cried for the wife who had been kept in the dark. I cried for the life we never got to finish. And with each SOB, the cedar box felt heavier, not because it was full of folders, but because it carried the proof of everything I hadn't known, the testament to his silent struggle. When the tears subsided, I wiped my cheeks and stood, steeling myself for the journey ahead. I lifted the cedar box into my arms, hugged it close, and strode toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open, and the cold winter air greeted me with biting clarity. My breath formed small clouds as I exhaled, and I realized that the world had not stopped turning. Christmas lights still twinkled on street trees, carolers hummed familiar tunes, and holiday shoppers jostled each other for last-minute deals. But I was changed. The whispers in my mind had been replaced by an undeniable truth. He had not betrayed me. He had been protecting me. He had built this hidden archive as a way to speak to me after he was gone. As I crossed the threshold into the brisk morning, I felt the cedar box's resolve infuse me. I knew in that moment that my next steps would not be driven by anger or resentment, but by compassion and love. I would read every page, honor his wishes, and when the time came, use his final gift to write the next chapter of my life. And, in doing so, I would keep his memory alive, not as a tragic secret, but as the greatest expression of love he ever left behind. That evening, I found him in the study, seated at the mahogany desk where he used to write me love notes on fresh stationery. The room smelled of leather-bound books and the faint residue of his cologne, one last trace of the man I thought I knew. In my hand was the small leather journal I'd discovered in the cedar box, its cover worn and creased with secrets. I closed the door behind me and set the journal on the desk with deliberate calm. He looked up from the flickering lamp, his eyes widening as if he recognized the weight in my gaze. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched like a taut wire between us. Then I spoke, voice steady but fierce. "Why didn't you tell me?" He swallowed, jaw working beneath the stubble on his chin, as though trying to chew through an unspoken excuse. "I was trying to protect you," he said softly, but even his words sounded rehearsed, inadequate against the truth I now carried. I picked up the first page of his confession, letter he'd embossed my initials on the cover in gold, and read aloud. "My dearest Emily, I know I've betrayed your trust, and I'll spend my last moments begging your forgiveness." His lips trembled, and he seemed to shrink back into the chair. "You left me no choice," he murmured. I held his gaze and continued, every syllable cutting through the years of denial. "I couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden. I wanted you to remember me as I was, before the sickness took hold." His shoulders slumped, grief and shame washing over him in equal measure. I closed the journal and placed it before him like evidence on a courtroom bench. "You built me into the defendant of my own marriage," I said, stepping forward until the desk separated us by mere inches. "You locked away our life together and left me to stumble through a minefield of rumors and doubts, all because you thought I couldn't handle the truth." He looked down, hands clasped in his lap. "I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid you'd fall apart. Afraid I'd lose you twice, once to the disease, once to your grief." I swallowed hard, the anger inside me flickering between betrayal and compassion. "You lost me the moment you chose secrecy over partnership," I replied, voice trembling in spite of myself. "Partnership means facing everything together." He raised his eyes, tears glinting in the lamplight. "I was selfish," he admitted. "In my fear, I became the monster I promised I never would. I thought I was sparing you pain, but all I did was break your heart." The confession hung heavy in the air, and I realized that every late-night lie, every strange withdrawal, every hush of denial had been a protective layer of his own making. "Read this," he said, sliding the unsent letter across the desk. "I wrote it years ago, but never had the courage to send it." The letter bared his soul. Regrets for moments missed, apologies for promising forever without telling me the end was coming. It ended with a plea for me to live fully after he was gone, to find joy again. I closed my eyes, feeling the residue of his words settling in my chest. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, voice soft as a sigh. But I understand now why you did it. He reached out, trembling, to take my hand, and for the first time in months, I didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin grounded me. I'm so sorry, he said, voice breaking. If I could turn back time, I would. I let a single tear escape as I nodded. We can't undo the past, I whispered, but maybe we can finish this chapter together. He swallowed, hope flickering in his eyes as he drew me closer. In that moment, confession became our bridge back to one another, fragile, trembling connection built on vulnerability rather than pretense. As midnight approached and the first snow began to fall outside, I closed the journal, tucked his letter into my coat pocket, and slipped my hand into his. We sat together in the lamplight, two imperfect souls, reckoning with love's hardest lesson. True intimacy demands truth, even when it hurts most. Sat at the edge of our empty bed that night, the divorce papers folded in my lap like a weight I could barely lift. Outside, the Christmas lights still glowed on the mantel, twinkling through the window like stars I once believed in. The cedar box rested on the dresser beside me, its hidden contents no longer mysteries but sacred truths. His diagnosis, his letters, his final confession. I traced the folds of the petition with a trembling finger, each line a testament to his fear and my heartbreak. Could I actually file this? Could I hand it back and walk away from everything we'd shared, Devon? What remained of our shared life? My mind spun through every moment of the past 2 weeks. The shock of finding the papers on Christmas morning, the rumors I'd chased like breadcrumbs, the secret key that unlocked the truth, the bank's underground vault where I'd unearthed, his private fight with mortality, and the confrontation that laid bare his deepest regrets. Now, here I was, at the last crossroads. Would I let him go? Free him from the shame of his own vulnerability? Or would I stay and face the final chapter together? On the dresser, his leather journal lay open to the last page he'd written in, the ink bleeding into the fibers, as if he'd run out of strength before he could finish his thought. I read the final sentence again and again. I want you to remember me laughing, not dying. Beneath it, his scrawled note. Your choice. Emily, please choose with your heart. My chest tightened. All along, he'd given me control over my future, over our future, knowing that I might choose to carry him to the end or let him go before the disease consumed him completely. I thought of the helplessness I'd felt when he fell ill, how powerless I'd been to save him. Would this be my chance to reclaim some agency, to steer our fate for once? I closed the journal and gently picked up the divorce petition. The typed words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Part of me wanted to sign, to step away with clean hands and a heart unburdened by caregiving and grief. To imagine a life beyond hospital corridors and whispered diagnoses, a life where I could rebuild myself. Free from the constant ache of watching him fade, I pictured myself walking away that very morning, carrying only a suitcase and the knowledge that I'd tried to save us both from a drawn-out agony. I could start fresh, write my own story, and honor the promise he'd made me, to live fully once he was gone. But another part of me recoiled at the thought of abandonment. Could I really walk away from the man who'd spent his final months planning for my grief? The one who drafted those papers not as rejection but as a gift, a desperate bid to spare me the burden of nursing him through the end. I thought of the letter he never sent, begging forgiveness for his secrecy and urging me to remember him alive. I pictured his tired smile flickering in my mind's eye, his hand brushing mine in that last confession. How could I toss those memories aside like unwanted pages? My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I rose from the bed and moved to the window. Snow had begun again, drifting down in perfect silence, thinning the world outside until all I saw were muted outlines. I pressed my palm against the glass, as if seeking warmth from the cold. I realized then that the choice before me wasn't about divorce or devotion. It was about love in its truest form. The willingness to face fear together, to forgive him for shielding me and to forgive myself for wanting to flee, to reclaim partnership in its raw state, stripped of pretense, forged in the crucible of mortality. I turned away from the window, back to the divorce papers. I placed my hand on the top sheet, feeling the ridges of the type, and let the pen drop from my fingers to the floor. Then, almost on instinct, I tore the document in half. It snapped like ice breaking on a winter lake, and I felt something inside me crack open, tooth a shell of betrayal giving way to compassion. I balled the halves in my fist and dropped them into the trash can by the nightstand. The finality of that gesture surprised me. The papers weren't just legal forms. They were the barrier between us. Now destroyed, I sat back on the bed, hands clasped together, and closed my eyes. In the hush that followed, I heard his breathing from across the hall, a soft rhythm steadying my racing thoughts. I stood and walked to the doorway, pausing before I called his name. His head lifted from the pillow, surprise flickering across his face as I entered. I held out the cracked journal, the fresh blank pages at the end waiting to be filled. No more secrets, I said, voice steady. No more petitions. We finished this together. His eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and gratitude as he nodded. Reaching out to take my hand, we sat on the edge of our bed, palms pressed together, and he poured out the rest of his heart. Fears he'd hidden even from himself, hopes he still clung to, a desire to spend whatever time remained in truth. I listened, tears sliding down my cheeks, each one a testament to love's endurance. Outside, the storm intensified, wind rattling the window frame like applause. In the safety of our shared confession, I realized that this moment, this choice was our greatest gift to each other. That night, we talked until the candle burned low. We made plans for doctor visits, for at-home care, for the friends we'd involve, and for the moments we'd still seize. Sunsets watched from our porch. Laughter shared over the smallest jokes. Memories revisited with honest tears and smiles. We reclaimed the diary's blank pages together, scripting our final chapter as partners, not as petitioner and respondent. And when sleep finally found us, we drifted off side by side, palms still entwined, hearts tethered by the renewed promise of us. So, what would you do if you stood at this crossroads? Would you walk away to save yourself, or would you tear up the papers and embrace love's hardest path? Let me know in the comments below, because some choices define not just our ending but the very essence of who we are.